Down in the valley, there were 3 farms. The owners of these farms had done well. They were rich men. They were also nasty men. All 3 of them were about as nasty and mean as any men you could meet. Their names were Farmer Boggis, Farmer Bunce, and Farmer Bean. Boggis was a chicken farmer. He kept thousands of chickens. He was enormously fat. This was because he ate 3 boiled chickens smothered with dumplings every day for breakfast, lunch and supper. Bunce was a duck and goose farmer. He kept thousands of ducks and geese. He was a kind of pot-bellied dwarf. He was so short, his chin would have been underwater in the shallow end of any swimming pool in the world. His food was doughnuts and goose livers. He mashed the livers into a disgusting paste and then stuffed the paste into the doughnuts. This diet gave him a tummy ache and a beastly temper. Bean was a turkey and apple farmer. He kept thousands of turkeys in an orchard full of apple trees. He never ate any food at all. Instead, he drank gallons of strong cider, which he made from the apples in his orchard. He was as thin as a pencil and the cleverest of them all. On a hill above the valley, there was a wood. In the wood there was a huge tree. Under the tree there was a hole. In the hole lived Mr. Fox and Mrs. Fox and their 4 small foxes. Every evening, as soon as it got dark, Mr. Fox would say to Mrs. Fox, "Well, my darling, what shall it be this time? A plump chicken from Boggis, a duck or a goose from Bunce, or a nice turkey from Bean?" And when Mrs. Fox had told him what she wanted, Mr. Fox would creep down into the valley in the darkness of the night and help himself. Boggis and Bunce and Bean knew very well what was going on, and it made them wild with rage. They were not men who liked to give anything away. Less still did they like anything to be stolen from them, so every night each of them would take his shotgun and hide in a dark place somewhere on his own farm, hoping to catch the robber. But Mr. Fox was too clever for them. He always approached a farm with the wind blowing in his face, and this meant that if any man were lurking in the shadows ahead, the wind would carry the smell of that man to Mr. Fox's nose from far away. Thus, if Mr. Boggis was hiding behind his chicken house number 1, Mr. Fox would smell him out from 50 yards off, quickly change direction, heading for chicken house number 4 at the other end of the farm. "Dang and blast that lousy beast!" cried Boggis. "I'd like to rip his guts out," said Bunce. "He must be killed," said Bean. "But how?" said Boggis. "How on earth can we catch the blighter?" Bean picked his nose delicately with a long finger. "I have a plan," he said. "You never had a decent plan yet," said Bunce. "Shut up and listen," said Bean. "Tomorrow we will all hide just outside the hole where the fox lives. We will wait there until he comes out. Then bang, 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 bang!" "Well, my darling," said Mr. Fox, "what shall it be tonight?" "I think we'll have duck tonight," said Mrs. Fox. "Bring us 2 fat ducks, if you please. One for you and me, and one for the children. Ducks it shall be, Bunce's best." Now do be careful." "Don't you worry about me. I'll see you later." But Mr. Fox wouldn't have been quite so cocky had he known exactly where the three farmers were waiting. They were just outside the hole, each one crouching behind a tree with his gun loaded. They had chosen their positions very carefully, making sure that the wind was not blowing from them towards the fox's hole. In fact, it was blowing in the opposite direction. There was no chance of them being smelled out. Mr. Fox crept up the dark tunnel. He poked his long, handsome face out into the night air and sniffed once. He moved forward and stopped. He sniffed again. He was always careful when coming out from his hole. He inched forward a little more. The front half of his body was now in the open. His black nose twitched from side to side, sniffing for the scent of danger. He found none, and he was just about to go trotting forward when he heard a tiny noise, as though someone had moved a foot ever so gently through a patch of dry leaves. Mr. Fox flattened against the ground, his ears pricked, but he heard nothing more. It must have been a field mouse or some other small animal. He crept a little further out of the hole. He was almost right out in the open now. He took a last careful look around. The wood was murky and very still. Somewhere in the sky the moon was shining. Just then his sharp night eyes caught a glint of something bright behind a tree. It was a small silver speck of moonlight shining on a polished surface. Mr. Fox lay still, watching it. Now it was moving, coming up and up. It was a gun! Mr. Fox jumped back into his hole as the entire wood seemed to explode around him. Bang, 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 bang! The smoke from the three guns floated upward. Boggis and Bunce and Bean came out from behind their trees and walked towards the hole. "Did we get him?" said Bean. One of them shone a flashlight on the hole, and there on the ground lay the poor, tattered, blood-stained remains of a fox's tail. Down the hole, Mrs. Fox was tenderly licking the stump of Mr. Fox's tail to stop the bleeding. "It was the finest tail for miles around," she said between licks. "It hurts," said Mr. Fox. "I know it does, sweetheart, but it'll soon get better." "And it'll soon grow again, Dad," said one of the small foxes. "It will never grow again," said Mr. Fox. "I shall be tailless for the rest of my life." He looked very glum. There was no food for the foxes that night, and soon the children dozed off. Then Mrs. Fox dozed off, but Mr. Fox couldn't sleep because of the pain in the stump of his tail. "Well," he thought, "I suppose I'm lucky to be alive at all. And now they've found our hole, we're going to have to move out as soon as possible. We'll never get any peace if we—" What was that? The noise he heard now was the most frightening noise. The scrape, scrape, scraping of shovels digging into the soil. Mrs. Fox began to cry. She gathered her 4 children close to her and held them tight. Suddenly, a shovel came right through the ceiling. The sight of this awful thing seemed to have an electric effect on Mr. Fox. "I've got it! Come on, there's not a moment to lose. Why didn't I think of it before?" "Think of what, Dad?" "A fox can dig quicker than a man," shouted Mr. Fox, beginning to dig. "Nobody in the world can dig as quick as a fox." Mr. Fox started to dig for dear life with his front feet. Mrs. Fox ran forward to help him. So did the 4 children. "Go downwards," ordered Mr. Fox. "We've got to go deep as we possibly can." The tunnel began to grow longer and longer, deeper and deeper below the surface. The mother and the father and all 4 of the children were digging together. Their front legs were moving so fast you couldn't see them, and gradually the scrunching and scraping of the shovels became fainter and fainter. After about an hour, Mr. Fox stopped digging. "Hold it," he said. They all stopped. They turned and looked back up the long tunnel they had just dug. All was quiet. As the sun rose the next morning, Boggis and Bunce and Bean were still digging. They had dug a hole so deep you could have put a house into it, but they'd not yet come to the end of the fox's tunnel. They were all very tired and cross. Bean rubbed the back of his neck with a dirty finger. He had a boil coming there and it itched. "What we need on this job," he said, "is machines, mechanical shovels. We'll have him out in 5 minutes with mechanical shovels." This was a pretty good idea, and the other 2 had to admit it. "All right then," Bean said, taking charge. "Boggis, you stay here and see the fox doesn't escape. Bunce and I will go and fetch our machinery. If he tries to get out, shoot him quick." The long, thin Bean walked away. The tiny Bunce trotted after him. The fat Boggis stayed where he was, with his gun pointing at the foxhole. Soon, two enormous caterpillar tractors with mechanical shovels on their front ends came clanking into the wood. Bean was driving one, Bunce the other. The machines were both black. They were murderous, brutal-looking monsters. "Here we go, then," shouted Bean.
"Death to the fox!"
shouted Bunce. The machines went to work, biting huge mouthfuls of soil out of the hill. The big tree under which Mr. Fox had dug his hole in the first place was toppled like a matchstick. On all sides rocks were sent flying and trees were falling, and the noise was deafening. Down in the tunnel the foxes crouched, listening to the terrible clanging and banging overhead. "What's happening, Dad?" cried the small foxes. "What are they doing?" Mr. Fox didn't know what was happening or what they were doing. "It's an earthquake!" cried Mrs. Fox. "Look," said one of the small foxes. "Our tunnel's got shorter. I can see daylight." They all looked round, and yes, the mouth of the tunnel was only a few feet away from them now, and in the circle of daylight beyond they could see the two huge black tractors almost on top of them. "Tractors!" shouted Mr. Fox, "and mechanical shovels! Dig for your lives! Dig, dig, dig!" Now there began a desperate race, the machines against the foxes. In the beginning, the hill looked like this. After about an hour, as the machines bit away more and more soil from the hilltop, it looked like this. Sometimes the foxes would gain a little ground, and the clanking noises would grow fainter, and Mr. Fox would say, "We're going to make it, I'm sure we are." But then a few moments later, the machines would come back at them, and the crunch of the mighty shovels would get louder and louder. "Keep going, my darlings," panted Mr. Fox. "Don't give up." "Keep going," Fat Boggis shouted to Bunce and Bean. "We'll get him any moment now." But by lunchtime the machines were still at it, and so were the poor foxes. The hill now looked like this. The farmers didn't stop for lunch. They were too keen to finish the job. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, this is what had happened to the hill. The hole the machines had dug was like the crater of a volcano.
"We'll never let him go,"
Bunce declared. "Never, never, never," cried Boggis. "Did you hear that, Mr. Fox?" yelled Bean, bending low and shouting down the hole. "It's not over yet, Mr. Fox. We're not going home till we've strung you up dead as a dingbat." Whereupon the three men all shook hands with one another and swore a solemn oath that they would not go back to their farms until the fox was caught.
"What's the next move?"
asked Bunce, the pot-bellied dwarf. "We starve him out," said Bean. "We camp here day and night watching the hole. He'll come out in the end. He'll have to." So Boggis and Bunce and Bean sent messages down to their farms asking for tents, sleeping bags and supper.